So we are about to start the last session of day 2. Thank you all for being here. And I would like to give a special thanks to Matthew Roderick, my co-chair in this session. Yes, thank you. While Tay, David, Darrow, and I are acknowledged on the program as the chairs of this symposium, this morning we recognize Rob's tremendous contribution, and it really is important to recognize Matthew's contribution as a steadfast member of the planning committee. He was on absolutely every single call. He did a lion's share of work, and so it's really important that we recognize his contribution going into the last session. And please, if you would like to come and help us think about coalescing a plan, please register for the session tomorrow for the last day. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I just want to give you a really quick background before we get into what I hope is a very robust conversation about the next steps. And it's really two things. So the first one is why I think I'm here right now holding the microphone is goes back to, for those of you not familiar with the space, there was a meeting called SEI 2020 back in 2019 that NIH put on, asking the question, what would disruption look like in the space of spinal cord injury research and translation 10 years from now? And that question provoked a lot of conversation. For us at our organization, Unite to Fight Paralysis, I'm an executive director, I'm a parent of a son with a spinal cord injury. We started to ask a lot of strategic questions, and one of them was looking at neuromodulation. And so right away, we facilitated, or started to facilitate, an invitation and then quarterly conference calls with neuromodulation scientists working in the space with a few questions around coherence of data sets and collaboration, outcomes, a number of questions like that. But one of the first things that came out of that very first conversation was we need to have a meeting. And that led to the Louisville meeting 2 years ago, which led to this meeting. And I'm standing here, I think, maybe, I don't know for sure, but at the end of the Louisville meeting, I asked some questions of the panel that was doing this, what we are going to do. Different stakeholders discussing the future of neuromodulation. And it's kind of unfortunate that was at the end of the meeting, and maybe it's unfortunate that's the end of this meeting. I don't know if it is a way to get everybody talking and thinking about the future. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, because that's what this conversation is going to be about with a varied group of stakeholders. The second is I just want to tell you a very quick story to set the tone for what I hope this conversation is like. And I wasn't planning to do this, but it hit me this morning that it might be a worthwhile story to tell. About 11 years ago, I witnessed a murder across the street from where George Floyd was killed. I was in a coffee shop in the early evening, summer, and I saw two guys right outside the window scuffle. I immediately kind of instinctively ran out of the coffee shop, where I saw the one guy stand up with a knife covered in dripping blood, and the other guy collapsed on the pavement. And we stood there for a second, the guy with the knife and I, maybe closer than Sam and I. He just looked at me, I looked at him, and I said, I just kind of went like this, can I help him? And he took off, ran away, and then I helped the guy. He died, pretty much right in front of me. And I spent the rest of the night telling the story to police, mostly, about what happened. And the reason why I tell this story to you is because I witnessed it right in front of my eyes, and I immediately had a narrative in my head about what happened. What I witnessed was the truth. The man who died was the assailant. He was the victim, which I found out later. He started the aggression. The other guy defended, which came out from multiple stories, multiple vantage points. He was not the murderer. There was a violent interaction. but it really taught me a profound lesson about what we witness, what we assume, what we revise, what we narrate about what we know may not be what we know. And it requires a collection of narratives, a collection of stories, a collection of truths to get to what's mostly true. That's what this discussion is about today. I want to use another image, sort of building off of that. Anybody who's gone to get glasses has sat in that chair with that device, and it's A or B, which is better. Lenses dropped in. What makes that A look like an A instead of a blur? The question I want to ask, and the question I want us to entertain, is how do we, different stakeholders in this space, regulators, advocacy organizations, people who have the injury, people who wish to make a profit from this injury and disseminate it to public health, people who want to understand the mechanism of it, people who will prescribe it. Everyone has a different way of looking at that letter. They're looking at a different lens. How do we stack the lenses so that, like the witnesses of that horrible thing I witnessed, we come up with a collective story that's as accurate as possible to what we are doing? And how do we get to a win? How do we get to a very clear, oh, that's an A? So that's the question that I want you to be thinking about, and I want you to entertain as we have a conversation going forward. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. No, that was just to get us set up for the questions. So, this is kind of open to any of you. We have had some pre-discussion, right? And we've been talking a little bit here and there through the whole meeting. Should I introduce you all first? Or does everybody know who you are already?
I think you should introduce it.
Should I? Okay, well, let's Vanessa, please introduce yourself.
So I'm Vanessa Noonan. I work as the Director of Research and Best Practice Implementation at the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute. So we're located in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And my colleague Arushi Reina spoke, and John Chernesky. So we're here as a team, and really excited to be here and see how we can be part of this discussion and part of the plan.
Hi, I'm Jen Wong. I'm the DVP of Clinical and Regulatory for Abbott's Neuromodulation business. So my team's responsible for driving global strategy for regulatory submissions and clinical studies worldwide. And so, yeah, similarly, I'm really excited to be here to really learn about the needs of this community and how we can help advance it.
I'm Heather Dean. I lead the team at FDA that reviews assistive devices, including many of the spinal cord stimulator devices for spinal cord injury. And like everyone else, I'm excited to be here and be part of moving this field forward.
I'm Erica Ross Ellison. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Regulatory and Quality for Onward Medical. We are a company that is focused on building devices specifically for folks with spinal cord injury. We'll reframe Matthew's premise of looking to profit from the injury and instead frame that as looking to bring real therapies to market for folks with spinal cord injury. Needing capital in order to invest and re-justify the investment we've made already to make it happen. So it's an expensive process bringing stuff out there for people, as I think you know. But really excited to be here, very passionate about this field, been in the neuromodulation field for a very long time, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation today.
I'm Uzma Samadani. I'm a neurosurgeon. I focus on neurotrauma, and I've done research in epidural spinal cord stimulation, and I also do clinical practice where I implant stimulators.
Nate Torgerson. I'm from Medtronic. I've worked in the neuromodulation space there for 34 years, mainly on the commercial side with deep brain stimulators and stimulators for chronic pain, but have been involved in research in SCI for 15 years.
Tracy Fernandez. I am a board member for United Fight Paralysis. I also am someone who basically ended up with a spinal cord injury after a bout of transverse myelitis, where I basically woke up paralyzed about 15 years ago. I am also the CEO of Triability Neuro Recovery Center, which is a physical therapy and occupational therapy center outside of the Chicagoland area. I have an epidural stimulator myself. We also have treated numerous other patients and helped them program their epidural stimulators, both people that have been part of clinical trials or had them implanted clinically. We are also running, one of the centers running the Anuvo Aspire transcutaneous upper extremity clinical trial in the Chicagoland area. So that's me.
Thanks all, and thanks for joining this panel. Thanks for being willing to share. Let's start off with a kind of a question loaded with questions underneath it, but hopefully it's understandable. And just so you all know, we're going to have kind of a kick-off conversation on the panel here, and then we're going to open this up to the room to engage. Okay. So the first question is how can we understand and/or is there a tension between the acute, the coming success? How do we have success acutely right now with what we know? And how does that translate to long-term sustainable success? And parallel to that, maybe another way to understand that, and which I think is a conversation that some have been having here for the last few days, do we know enough now to say it's time for a win? Or is there more that we need to know? And are those things in tension? Like, are we ready to go? Or are we jumping too soon relative to that long-term success? Or, yeah, should we hit the ground running with what we know and let's make it happen? Open it up to you all.
I think maybe one perspective I could offer as a manufacturer is just the importance on focusing on a specific unmet need or problem that you're trying to solve, and really just building out from there, because it is so important to get to that sustainable growth. So the example I would like to share is when we're developing our virtual clinic, which is a remote programming technology, which I know would be of great value to this community. And we started with an unmet need based on the limited number of neurologists in certain geographical areas. We knew that our Parkinson's patients would need access to this therapy. And we thought about what it could really take to make it safe and secure. You saw the infrastructure that Doug presented yesterday. It really had a strong thought process behind it. And we're really just focused on proving out that one use case. And we started a study in Australia to really characterize those benefits and risks. What happened was the pandemic hit. And we knew we had to pause and pivot. And we then thought, okay, well, it's not just this one patient population, it's more. And how can we really help all of our therapies, our spinal cord stimulation patients, our dorsal root ganglion patients who need access to programming optimization in a time that they don't. And really from there, it was partnering with regulators. It was understanding from our reimbursement colleagues what it would take to get this product to both market and then further in reimbursement. So from a technological standpoint, we were able to solve that problem, but it was really the stakeholder management that became most challenging. And even after we got approval and we now have 30,000 programming sessions, we continue to study and evaluate the effects in Parkinson's patients. And we're able to show that there's actually a faster optimization to the desired settings through remote programming rather than in-person sessions. And that's what's gotten us to reimbursement. And as we continue to expand to now nearly 20 countries, what's actually the barrier is privacy and understanding the privacy regulations. So at each stage, we've just added this layer of complexity. So that's just where, from our perspective, to start with a focus and then kind of navigate to getting things more complex, that helps with a level of sustainable growth.
And I'll add to that. Jen and I actually got to work together on that project when I was at Abbott prior to joining Onward, and that we started with 11 people in Australia for that submission. So it's pretty cool to see such a perfect example of where you can start with demonstrating something is safe and effective in a certain use case, and then expand with real-world evidence like that. And I think our field has a lot to learn in spinal cord injury, following models like that, creative regulatory models like that, and strategies.
Can I comment?
So when you said, are we ready to go? Well, I think there's a couple examples where we already are going, right? We're just going forward with the transcutaneous stimulation and have finished the study there, and plans to go on with epidural. A couple of questions on that. We've mentioned this, and maybe there'll be a future question or conversation about collaborative communities. And when you say, are we ready to go, we have to define kind of we, I think, right? Who is we, and how do we work together?
And what is success, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I was thinking about this, like, I remember having a brand new computer, I was excited about it, and I would talk to a friend of mine that worked at Intel, and he's working on the third generation beyond that, the computer, he's like, well, that computer's not very good, right? So there's a little bit of that too, like, we had this research, and there's teasers, right, promising more and more, but I think really talking to the community, really understanding the people with SCI, what is good enough initially, but then how do we plan to continue to enhance what they have, as we learn more. I think that's probably, the ultimate, the better plan is we got to get out there, but we know it's not going to be the finished product, right? We're going to learn so much. We have already, every conference we have, there's more and more information about improvements. Mm-hmm. So, but we can't let, as mentioned earlier, we can't let perfect get in the way of good enough, but really having that feedback.
There'll always be a better mousetrap,
yeah.
Right? I mean, that's part of it. And I appreciate that you brought that up, because that's at the heart of the question is, what is the we, and as Tracy said, what is the how do you define win? How do you define success? And the reason why I wanted to entertain this question is because, I mean, it's come up a little bit here and there, maybe more subtext than explicit, of, there are, and I know plenty of scientists, researchers in this space who are saying, well, we don't want to move too fast. Do we know enough yet? And I joke sometimes with some scientists that they have a fetish for mechanism, and they have to shake a little bit of that off and recognize there's a lot of strategies, technologies that are in use in the world that are not 100% understood, and there's always more to understand. So I think it's important. Tracy, I'm really curious from you, having lived experience, mm-hmm. and actually what you described at your physical therapy center. You have people, you've done clinical trials with transcutaneous, you have people who have epidural stimulators implanted. How do you see this?
So, we've had a variety of people in different levels with epidural stimulators implanted. I was the first one at our clinic that actually had that done. Mine is transverse myelitis, so it knocks me out of a lot of clinical trials to begin with, and or the ones that I could go and be a part of, as I just mentioned, I'm a business owner, I have 2 children, I just couldn't pack up my life for a year and a half to go do that. So grateful that I had the opportunity. With about the 9 or 10 patients, they've all had different experiences, different benefits. I can stand, I can do a stand pivot. Today, normally I stand up every day in a stander prior to just getting this, and if I don't, I get super uncomfortable, super crampy, but now I can, in my room, stand up, hang on to grout. It's provided a lot of those benefits. Is that a true win? Am I up there walking? Is that success? I don't know. For me, it is. For me, it's a big deal. I can stand up and, quite frankly, help pull my pants up. You guys don't appreciate that, but it takes a long time for those of us who can't do it. It's also helped with UTIs. It helps with bowel and bladder. It helps in so many different people within our clinic are having different experiences and are trying to find programs and things that work for them, even if it's just improving their blood pressure so that they can actually sit up and not spend most of their day in bed, right? So those are wins, but they're wins for everybody that's different. And doing that in our ability to program that in our best way that we know how, does that mean that we know how to program it like Megan can or like Susie's team can? Or no, but we are all sharing together and collaborating with other clinicians that are doing this. We've studied the research, we've talked to folks, we are trying to do this the best and safest way that we can. To me, that's a win. To me, that's success, and it's success that people can have right now, that just simply either can't be part of a trial or for some reason don't want to wait to be part of a trial. We are also doing the transcutaneous trial, which it's night and day, right? Because there's so much more time and effort and money and cost and documentation and all of those things. Yes, there is definitely a place for that. It's very important. We're actually the #1 enrollee for that trial for upper extremity recovery. And, you know, I think that's great. It's so good to see that start to progress too. And it's also kind of hard to watch that because we have a lot of spinal cord injury patients at our clinic, and I know which ones are in the sham and which ones aren't. And you're just like, oh, well, you know, so, you know, those are things that we all struggle with as well. But, you know, hopefully these people will at some point get to be part of a home trial and be able to see the benefits that we're seeing. So I think there's a time and a place for both. I think there's good and bad. You know, obviously we have to do the research in order to ensure that these things are safe and effective. I don't think we research things until we have a perfect solution, because we're never going to have a perfect solution. And this community is desperate for anything. And I know we have to be careful, because if we're desperate for something, we don't want to roll something out and overpromise and underdeliver, because we've also all experienced that for years and years and years. But to sit here and watch all these people walk in labs and stand in labs and watch it for year after year after year, it's discouraging for so many people with a lived experience. So I guess that's my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, clearly a win is getting to market. And I want to say, I know sometimes FDA can seem like the big bad barrier to that. I hope one thing that you gathered from the talks this morning is that we are here to be partners. We want to make sure that what gets to market is shown to be safe and effective, and not just to get through the regulatory hurdles, but also, you know, with the help of my colleagues like Kai, you know, with the TAP program, make sure that you're well set up, the companies are well set up to get through the other hurdles. You know, FDA, there are reasons that we want to see well-controlled, preferably randomized controlled trials that are well-blinded with validated blinding assessments. And we want to make sure we can be sure of that data, not just for us, but then for the other stakeholders. And I know it can be frustrating, you know, if clinical trials are expensive. But I think there's been a lot of research that is now funneling into the clinical trials that will help us, you know, help you get through what you need to actually make it to market with successful devices.
So I don't want to put you on the spot. I'll get to you both. But you said something Wednesday afternoon that kind of building on what Tracy said in your response at the end of the afternoon, where you said maybe we have to rethink how we look at spinal cord injury, given what I think, and again, I don't want to put you on the spot, and you just tell me, no, I don't want to answer that, but Tracy just described the complexity around what people value and what people need, what people can get recovery for and from. And you made a comment, I think, Wednesday afternoon, sort of relative to that I think we at FDA need to consider maybe looking at this differently for spinal cord injury.
Well,
can you elaborate?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So you know, the question was, very often we need a randomized clinical trial, a randomized control trial that really focuses on a particular indication. So we really understand that a device is safe and effective for that particular indication. And there are then often indications can be expanded as more data is collected. You know, there are benefits and drawbacks to that approach. Is there a way to collect data in a number of indications, a number of areas all at once, and go to market with something that's more general, more broad? And I don't know. One of the things I keep pushing is this idea of a collaborative community, so that can be discussed. How do you design the right clinical trial to get that kind of indication? And if you were to come together and discuss that and invite FDA to be part of those discussions, you know, this would not be an advisory committee. It's not that you're telling us how to do something, but it is very helpful for us to understand, you know, what it is that the community sees as a need. You're the experts. What do you see as a possibility? You know, maybe that's something that we can discuss. I don't know. I don't know exactly what would be needed, you know, to get these things to market with certain indications, but it's worth having the discussion.
And one of the things, you know, that I think is interesting is if we've looked at some of the TSS devices, the transcutaneous devices that are about to come to market, whether it's Onwards or Nuvos or Spinex or whoever it might be, right? Most of those clinical trials are all on upper extremity and upper extremity functional recovery. Well, you know, we know that most times if it's upper extremity, is it really going to hurt to use it on a lower extremity limb, right? So from an FDA perspective, but if these things have to be prescribed and they're only prescribed for people at a cervical level and not a paraplegic now, that's a little discouraging for people at a different level. So I would encourage us as a group, because I think that's where we're headed, to really start to think that through, because you're knocking out a huge portion of the people when these devices first roll out.
So I'll address, I think that's a really great point. I think to your earlier point about over-promising and under-delivering, we also don't want to develop a broad therapy that we think works for everything, and we don't know. Like demonstrating, we do need to have powered studies to show, look, it does actually look like it's safe and effective in this population of people to do this thing we really care about. And with some creative statistics on board, we can do that later. And I just want we submitted we submitted our application to FDA, our de novo, a few weeks ago, and I think that's the first time we've had a new therapy for spinal cord injury in a very long time. So,
and we're super excited about that. I'm not saying anything from that perspective, right? Anything that can go to the market. I'm just talking about, is there a way to make things, maybe from an FDA perspective or whose ever perspective, so that it's not so narrow, I guess, when it first rolls out.
And my last point on this is just that I think this is a nice foot in the door, and I think there's a lot of, again, to the example Jen brought up about our remote programming platform. There's some really creative stuff that can happen later.
Tracy, I think what you're saying is actually a limitation of how research is conducted in the United States. Because the problem is when you do a trial, you want the trial to work. You want it to have a positive outcome. So what you do is you make inclusion and exclusion criteria that optimize the likelihood of a positive outcome measure that's measurable. Sure. You want to have an objective, measurable outcome measure. And so when they put these trials together, you exclude penetrating injury, you exclude things like transverse myelitis or demyelination, you'll exclude, for example, it's easier to put a stimulator percutaneously on the cervical spine than it is on the lumbar spine because of anatomy. So you're going to exclude, for example, people with thoracic or lumbar pathology. And so you end up only including a very small subset. And that becomes your quote-unquote intended use population for a pre-market approval or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to use bad language.
You were perfect.
Okay, good. Especially not in front of you. But anyway, so what happens is then that's right. What's cleared. And then that becomes a challenge for people who fall outside the box. And yes. It's sort of unfair. I agree with you 100%. But it's the nature of research in the United States. Because you want your study to succeed and you have limited funding.
Yes, no, and I completely understand that. I'm just trying to think about when these things start to come to market and we're all excited that they're coming, and I don't want to discourage that at all. I just know we treat so many spinal cord injury in my clinic, and I'm going to say, okay, this is only approved for, you didn't see me do that, but for cervical, although right now I'm using a Genesis Vectra with some of the Russian parameters, and we use that for transcutaneous in our clinic, and we use an Excite transcutaneously in our clinic just to try and do clinical use, and we do that for help with lower level function as it is. So there's people are already doing this, and they're doing it with other devices that are not yet approved, or they're using them a little bit off label, and they are working, and that's just happening in clinics all around. So.
Leslie?
So to be clear, once FDA has allowed something to be marketed, once it's out there, we have no regulatory authority over clinical practice.
Right.
So
I love
the
it
companies,
when you say that.
the companies, they cannot advertise it
Right.
as being used
can't
outside
market
of
it.
its indication.
Right.
But once it's out there, clinicians and therapists can use it as they wish.
So
That's a key point, I think.
I'm going to stand
Leslie,
up
go
because
ahead.
I'm behind the podium here. So I just wanted to comment as a clinician and as a researcher. Are we there yet, or are we going too slowly? I would say that we are on the cusp of getting our first indication in spinal cord injury. That is tremendously exciting for the field. Literally, hats off, well done. We need 1,000 times more that effort, testing in multiple different areas. Every single indication that you want, we need the bandwidth capacity, and we need the push to be able to ask and answer those questions in a thoughtful, honest way. And so, Uzma, I would deviate a little bit from your perspective on clinical trials. I think we have responsibilities as scientists to ask questions and to be open to the answers, yes or no. Every single time we design an experiment, every single time we run a trial, every single time we go into this space, we have to be open to the possibility that this does not work. And if we're not open to that, then we're not really doing research. We're doing something distinct from research. And so clinical trials are not, there shouldn't be an inherent bias to have this be correct, to have a certain outcome. We have to be open to failures and wins in different indications. And that's why when we say this is very complex and there are all of these indications in spinal cord injury, yes, it's going to win in some spaces and it's not going to be effective in some spaces. And we need to be open to that. We have to have the capacity, the bandwidth, the intellectual capacity, the drive to ask those questions and answer them. That's what this is all about.
Well, but then there's an
But
added...
let me finish. That is our obligation as researchers. Now I'm going to step into this space and I'm going to talk to you as a clinician. As a researcher, I have to ask and answer hypothesis-driven questions. That's my obligation, and they have to be relevant, they have to be important to you, they have to move the field forward. As a clinician, it is my obligation to offer to my patients what I know to be evidence-based, impactful, safe, and important. Two completely different obligations, two completely different roles, two completely different questions. Off-label has a limitation. It has a strength. There's a role for it. It can help us accelerate, but it is inherently pushing disparities in medicine. Why? Because the people who can pay out of pocket to fly around the country, to fly around the world, and to go and pay for these things that have not been proven are getting a different advantage. And so us as a field, if we really want to address health disparities, we have to push the field forward equitably and let everybody benefit from these technologies at exactly the same time.
So Vanessa, that's where you come in, because we actually talked briefly yesterday, thank you, about justice and the voice of the patient in this mix between scientist and clinician and company and regulator. Please.
Yeah, so I think it's a super important perspective, and I would would agree, Leslie, because when we think of justice, it's giving fair and equitable treatment, to access to the treatments and innovations people need. And access is your ability to pay. It's being able to receive those treatments no matter where you live. You know, if you're in an urban, rural, remote setting. And then it's your age. Are you pediatric, older, you know, adults, and then as you age. And so I think that is the goal, is equitable, fair access. And I think their journeys to get to all of that may look a little bit different. And we've got a number of successes, but I think what we could and we have learned over this conference is, what do we know today? And then how do we accelerate? Because Rob's comments stuck with me today. Like, time is of the essence. And then I was thinking, you know, could we think of this as a data problem? What data sets do people have? What could we learn from the past? Because we don't want to keep wasting time going forward, you know, necessarily designing the perfect study without learning from our past. And so trying to think of what are those accelerators to get us from where we are today to where we want to go, and always keeping that voice and the voice and the needs of people with spinal cord injury, because certainly that's what brings me to my position, and I think about a lot.
That's a good segue to maybe a last question, and then we open it up. How much time do we have today?
Oh, I've lost track.
Okay. We have plenty of time, folks. So as it relates to that, like, it's kind of a two-part question again. Practical. What are some practical steps that we can take collectively? I know we've already invoked the collaborative communities, maybe independent consortium, maybe there's multiple ways to tackle that. But part of that is also data-driven. And Leslie, what you just described, I can't help but make a comment that some folks from Drexel are here. We were just talking about this earlier. Daniel Mickle, the CSO of NerveGen, gave a very compelling presentation and highlighted the divergence of preclinical data and clinical trials, that clinical trials are not using vetted preclinical data. You know, you're not looking at a model of the injury that's clinically relevant. You're not looking at the level of injury, the severity of injury. You're using hemisections to do traumatic spinal cord injury. So there's a problem in the research to clinic sort of continuum, in that in almost every trial in spinal cord injury that's addressing restoration of function, neural stem, stem cell inc, RENETX, et cetera, the trials that have ostensibly failed, we're using data preclinically that wasn't relevant. So it's a relevant question now in terms of what data is necessary to create the appropriate feedback loop between what's moving forward and what we don't yet understand, and how is that information traveling back and forth between these parallel paths of understanding mechanism better, understanding the patient profile better, predictability for sustainable intervention over time.
Just jump in even too clinically, like we see just a small subset of the data in the publications, but there's often a large amount of data collected in trials and studies maybe that's not published, and we have negative data. And so I'm thinking of my own, you know, having done research as well. So it's starting to think as a paradigm shift of this open science as much as we can to kind of bring us forward, at least on the data side, and see if we can take advantage of some of the AI and some of the tools that will become available to us and are becoming widely available to understand this complexity and to see if we can maximize what we do know in all of the different body systems we've tested with all of the measures to guide us to see if it can be an accelerant, coming back to Rob and this time of the essence kind of thinking.
And I'm kind of curious from the company standpoint, sorry, you know, this is another conversation I've had with a number of folks, and I think other people are having it, is sort of this asking, you know, whether it's in epidural stimulation or whether it's transcutaneous right now, there's a lot of people out there who've had interaction with spinal cord stimulation, patients with lived experience, people with lived experience. How is that going to move forward and be available, fed back to researchers within your companies, and you're collecting data, you're using that to predict where your products may be applicable, et cetera. Like, how is that going to fit into how things move forward to ensure sustainable success, profitability?
I feel like there's two pieces to what you're saying. One is absolutely how can we leverage big data, right? And I think that's where we're learning about that right now in the patient populations that we're in. And it's kind of what I referenced even about even trying to expand with virtual clinic, the amount of privacy challenges that we've experienced. It's not as straightforward as you would think. It sounds very optimistic and very valuable, but what we found is that even just the informed consents that we provide for people to use our products have to be very specific about how we're going to use that data. And so I actually would appreciate more of a privacy perspective at the table, if that's a key constraint that we need to solve to get to that access. And I do think that we can learn from other patient populations and apply it to spinal cord injury too. I don't think it has to be specific.
But also retrospective data, case reports are not going to be as impactful if we're trying to move the needle on reimbursement and funding. And so we need well-designed randomized clinical trials to get into that space.
And I think that's the other piece that I would encourage, if there is going to be a collaborative community, the question that I would pose is how can we characterize the risks across the heterogeneity of the population so that if we could make an argument of where we focus the RCT, it would be on what you would consider the superset of risks, so that you can get to a place where the subsequent studies that you're doing are really only maybe you're confirmed on safety, and maybe it's just a smaller group of effectiveness that you have to prove, right? And there's a more structured way that you can go about it systematically. But I think we need that information about just how the risks play out across all these different manifestations of symptoms and injuries.
45 minutes.
Wow.
We
Really?
scheduled a lot. We have 12 more.
We have a lot of time.
That's my color.
Yeah.
Just a comment. It's very important to get the people with spinal cord injury involved. One thing that is very beneficial for these smaller feasibility studies, unlike a pivotal, because a pivotal you're very structured and you don't want to interfere with the data. But in the feasibility studies, you can have these open conversations. So as they try the therapy, you really want to walk the journey with them and say, okay, you know what your starting point was. As you've gone along, how did that feel? What did you experience? And was that a win for you? As you mentioned, like Tracy was saying. We've been working with Dr. Harkaman in Louisville. We've had 53 patients implanted. And so you want to talk with them and see, what is a win? Was that good enough? Or what changed in your life? And a lot of times they won't know up front, right? I think when you were randomizing them, some of them were in cardiovascular. They cried because they didn't want to be in that study. They wanted to be in the functional motion one. But when they actually experienced it, they said, wow, I didn't realize the difference that was going to make in how I was thinking. But now you have to think about that. Every new patient didn't live that, and they don't know that. So would they sign up for a cardiovascular, because that's not probably what's on top of mind for them when they first get injured. So it's a great learning experience, and I think sharing that information is really important for us to know what a win is and how to move forward.
I'm really curious to hear too from anybody in here with a spinal cord injury lived experience. One of the things that occurred to me when I was thinking about this discussion was, the cliche in our community is that 5 years thing, right? It's 5 years. People get injured. It's 5 years, we'll have something for you. 5 years. Well, the 5 years is now, right? I mean, there's an emerging technology that will be applied now. But the question is, well, what is it? And how do you define what you're just describing, Nate? Like someone who's crying because they don't get in the thing that they associate with restoration of function, not even cognizant of what function I've adapted to without even really thinking about it. And so I'm curious to hear from any of you, how you think about that and hear that. And again, back to this question of justice, what's the conduit for you to communicate that?
Yeah, my 5 years is taken 30 years. But I think this is the elephant in the room here. You know, I think we're currently in the trickle that's about to become a flood. You know, we're already seeing more and more people are using devices, both transcutaneous and epidurally, you know, outside of their originally intended purpose. But now we have specialized products that are entirely intended for this purpose that are coming. And so as we see more and more people using it off-label or however you want to define that, you know, that's going to ramp up quite rapidly as people become aware of it. They start to hear about it. They see their friends that are experiencing it and the benefits they're getting. So what I'm wondering is, how are we preparing for the coming flood? Because I think it's going to come upon us a lot quicker than most people are expecting. And nobody's talking about the hundreds of thousands of people with spinal cord injury in North America and around the world who are going to be like, I need this device, and I need a physiotherapist, and I need a doctor to help me with this, and I need to optimize it. And there's going to be a demand on our clinical practices and on how we are applying these things and how people are using them and sharing of this knowledge that I don't know if we've ever seen. We've certainly never seen it in spinal cord injury. So that's my question is, who's thinking about the coming flood of persons with spinal cord injury that are going to want to access this and are going to access it?
And how do we get the community ready, increase health literacy, and be prepared to avoid the profiteering that will come, that is not represented on this panel today, but will without doubt take advantage of the first indication and the second indication?
There's only so many Tracy's and so many centers that she has that are prepared to take people on, but there's going to be a lot more people than Tracy can handle real quick.
And it's an interesting concept. We only opened in September of 2019, so right before the pandemic. We opened in a 2,400 square foot facility with myself as the business and my business partner and a part-time PTA. And we've now are about to move to a 7,400 square foot facility. We have a 20 to 25 person wait list all the time, and we just can't hire fast enough. And that's not all spinal cord injury. We also are doing some traumatic brain injury. We're doing MS. We're using the PONS device for MS. So, you know, we're doing a lot of other things as well. But I totally agree with you. Facilities are not going to be prepared and not trained to really use these devices. I know we have been training and using devices like this for the past 4 or 5, you know, my business partner even before then, years. But I think that's rare, and I think that's something that as a community we really need to think about and focus.
And I want to comment really quickly, I'm not being self-congratulatory, but there are advocacy groups in this space that are thinking about this and have been for a while. We've been thinking about this. That's why the Activity-Based Therapy Association that we're working to form years ago came from this anticipation. There are things emerging, and the clinical pathway, the clinical capacity is not there. And how do we help build that? That was why after SCI 2020, we put this neuromodulation kind of working group, you know, to put together, was to anticipate what's missing. What do we have to do to get ready? Because us who have lived experience know how broken the healthcare system is.
Well,
and how few access to good physicians, good care, good service, depending upon what state you live in this country. It's crazy. And so in a sense, I'd love to hear from any PM&R docs or physical therapists in this space also, to how are you thinking about what the issue that John raised?
So you write to the state and get a grant and learn how to do it properly. Biased opinion, obviously.
If you have a state that funds spinal cord injury research like we do here.
Yeah.
But I don't
Illinois
think
doesn't do that.
oversimplification is the answer, right? Because there's as much detriment that can come from doing something poorly than doing something not at all, right?
Right.
Because I have people come into my clinic with all sorts of mental issues and things like that have happened from having stimulators put in and having them not followed up on. I can say the vast majority of the ones I have get fed up with it and turn it off for 2 weeks because they just can't deal because of the problem, because there's no one to help. And there's no one trained to help right now. And that's not, I know Tracy and also the group at the VA are putting their effort and heart and everything they have into doing what they think is best and safe to help the patients that have them. But I don't think that should be the focus. I think the focus should be working towards something that is reproducible and that can give us equitable outcome amongst people with implantations. So we still have a lot to go there. And then I have one other comment in that I don't think our limitation right now is risk. I think our limitation is choosing an outcome. So that's what we need to work on. That's it.
Well, I've got kind of three, probably more comments, but you know, part of the organizing, I really, really wanted to get somebody from like United Healthcare here. Because they're not here and they need to be, and we need to hear their perspective. We can't assume what we don't know from the things they look at, especially behind closed doors. Or we need to find somebody that will speak on behalf of that and not give us the company line. We can try. Leslie, I think you're very right, and we, as a patient, as somebody living with this injury, I want this to happen as fast as possible. I mean, I'm well informed, but when I go to a doctor's office, I want them to be more informed than I am and to give me the pros and the cons. And I understand that it's practicing medicine. Do no harm, you're going to harm patients. And what is that risk in its overall benefit of the society? And but going into these decisions well informed and knowing how to mitigate your personal risk acceptance is what, as a patient, I'm comfortable with. The third thing, you know, and Nate, you know the wooden box pacemaker story that more than anybody here, but you know, the pacemaker was invented a long time ago in a garage probably, and it turned into Medtronic. But I'm curious about that translation, and then how many studies were before that, how much evidence, and then how much happened after that? I mean, we're looking at continuous improvement over a long life cycle. We're not going to start out perfect, but we know that, hey, something's going on here and it's helping lives. And so.
Yeah, so, I mean, there was no FDA guidance in 1945 when they made that box, and Earl Bakken brought it to the doctor, and to his surprise, they used it on a person the next day, right? So that's a world that none of us really want to live. I mean, these pros and checks of having different sets of eyes on things is important. And I think we're trying to work together to streamline it, but not reduce the significance of what we all bring to the table. But I think we're all sort of in this that we know we're going to learn. Everyone that's been in has had studies. We've heard it from the participants that it's very dynamic, right? Like some of the transcutaneous trial information, they were getting better and better, then the trial stopped. What's going to happen? There's optimism that there's going to be more as they get it on, get the commercial. So there's a lot of things we don't know yet. And I think as businesses, we do look at that we want to design it in a way that will allow improvements. We've talked about using real-world data as a lever to, as we learn, to maybe expand the labeling or, in the future. I think that would be a really good thing for a collaborative community to think about. Like, how could we use real-world data? Because every clinical study is a barrier because of the expense. But once you get that product in, how can we collect real-world data so that maybe you don't have to do nearly as many of those?
And the real-world data of the intervention, especially if I'm understanding it correctly, because I want to link it to Rob's second comment, is the real-world data has to take into account the real-world condition of people with spinal cord injury now, without the intervention. Because what you mentioned, Rob, about risk, I want to make sure is understood and heard, because it's been, I've had this conversation throughout the last few days, is that risk for people with spinal cord injury people are assuming that risk on a daily basis. It is not static. My son's been injured for 16 years, and I've witnessed the degradation of his body over those 16 years. So that risk is not static. It is assumed daily. And so that cannot be forgotten in the discussion of the risk of an intervention. That's up to it's up to everyone at some level, but the person with lived experience gets a lot of determination in how that risk is defined.
I'm going to make a comment, Rob. So in some ways, it's apples to oranges if we think about spinal cord injury and cardiovascular disease, because the numbers are just not in our favor. So there are a couple of ways that we can overcome that as a community. One is that we can create more research environments, support increased infrastructure, give more access to be more efficient about the way that we're doing research. The other thing that we can do is increase the efficiency of our trials, which requires collaboration of everybody in the field, getting together and being very flexible, open, willingness to share data, protocols, expense, and participate in some of the adaptive trial designs, why could a platform study not work for spinal cord stimulation? Why couldn't we not have rolling capacity to ask questions, assess more quickly, and then yes, no, and then move on to the next intervention or the next indication or the next way that we're going to be delivering this. So we don't have the numbers in our favor, so we have to be smarter about that and not expect that things are going to happen as quickly in conditions where there is simply more prevalence.
Rob, I just want to make one comment about United Healthcare being at the table. Don't underestimate United Healthcare. They are everywhere. They know. So first of all, I've implanted 58 stimulators. Well, they are, but I've implanted 58 stimulators. I've had only 2 patients have to pay out of pocket. One was a patient who came from the United Kingdom and paid out of pocket, and the second one was a patient with Wisconsin Medicaid. And she had to pay out of pocket because Wisconsin Medicaid doesn't pay for care out of state. So other than that, every single patient, we've gotten it through insurance, and it's gotten easier and easier and easier. And why is that? It's because United Healthcare knows that once a patient has a stimulator, they may have perhaps a slightly decreased risk for UTI. They may have a lesser likelihood for small bowel obstruction or large bowel obstruction or constipation. They track absolutely every single thing that we do as clinicians. They know when our patients get readmitted. They know when they have complications, when they have infections. They know everything. So the fact that they're now approving this without even my having to make a phone call suggests to me that the insurance companies actually do know what works, and they don't care about marketing authorization.
Before we move on to the next question, I would like to go back to the comments about real-world evidence, because I do think that's a really strong point. And I think it also is a way to help address what you're saying about the longitudinal type of risks that need to be understood. And that is something that we've been working on. We recently got an approval for diabetic peripheral neuropathy, where we specifically used safety information from Medicare databases. And I think the challenge there is that if the coding is not consistent, then it really limits the types of conclusions that we can make. It is anonymized, so then it addresses some of the privacy things that we have concerns about. But if there's also a way to think about whether there could be a standardization of a registry where it's a known, that we have more information about the demographics, we have more information about the outcomes. That's what is needed to get to a place to leverage real-world data.
Okay. There, and then, are you? Yeah.
My name is Kobe Smith. For one to start, what Leslie was touching on before is the way I paraphrase it is there are no 2 spinal cord injuries that are exactly the same. To touch on what Rob was alluding to as far as informed providers, that's kind of one of my challenges is I almost have to do my own vetting process to find providers that have spinal cord injury experience. The greatest challenge is in the field of primary physicians, also primary physicians with clinics with the accessibility needs something as simple as a four-year lift.
Yeah.
And then the third part, going back to what Matt was alluding to, is I'm 25 years, a little more than 25 years post-injury, back in 1998. And at that time, I was hearing, we're 5 years away from a cure. And I would say, like, from a psychological standpoint, me personally, it was more, I'm not going to sit around and wait for a cure. I'm going to maximize my life. But it does go back to a psychological aspect of spinal cord injury. The unfortunate reality is that the leading cause of death for individuals with spinal cord injuries under 55 is suicide. And that's where kind of this push to maximize treatments for spinal cord injuries becomes all the more important and maybe helpful, and advocacy is also highlighting the psychological component.
Thank you for that comment. Somebody in the room, correct me if I'm wrong. I think there are 3 SCI fellowship trained physicians, physiatrists in the state of Minnesota. Is that right? 3? You're one of them. I'm looking at you. I believe there are 2 others because I looked and tried to recruit people here. Yeah.
There's a handful. I mean, and they're becoming more. The problem is we have a huge population. I have 600 patients and a 3-month waiting list.
Yeah.
So, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 in Minneapolis, and most of them spend all their time in acute rehab and don't take outpatient.
5 SCI fellowship trained physicians in Minneapolis? I don't think so. Yeah.
Yvonne?
It's been a chaotic conversation, so I've definitely had a lot of ideas. I'll just make 3. Oh, sorry. Right here. Yeah.
She can't stand
No,
up.
I cannot stand up. I'd love to. Maybe in a couple months. I'm working on it.
Just forgive Tay.
It's all good.
Do that again.
Okay.
But yeah, so I've had a lot of ideas over the past 20, 30 minutes. First, again, I had my stimulator implanted about a week ago. Thank you, Dr. Samadani. And I can say that I've already had some wins. Those wins being reduced spasticity, reduced swelling in my feet. And if that's all I get, that's fine, honestly. And I will also have the peace of mind that knowing that I tried. Second thought is that regardless of a stimulator or not, echoing the fact that there is not enough spinal cord injury specialized physical therapy anywhere. I immediately after injury went back to my college town, started working out at like a typical paid for by insurance PT location, and they had me lifting dumbbells. And I was like, guys, my arms are not the problem here. I have a T11 spinal cord injury. And so after about the 3rd time, I fired that PT and decided to work with a different one. But just to say that, like, while to John's point, it's important to consider the flood that is coming, but the flood's already here. This isn't something that we should use as a reason to not push forward or to slow us down. Right. And my 3rd point, to piggyback off that, is that it is every person's responsibility to take on their own health. Every person with a spinal cord injury in this room has taken personal responsibility. I'm not saying it's fair, I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it is necessary. And so, like, we are an important partner here, and that we can also figure stuff out on our own to some extent. Don't force us into a box. Don't make us reliant on a system that we all know is broken and doesn't really care. Let us be creative, be imaginative, and come up with our own solutions as well. I guess finally, a really good measurement for outcomes is moving more on my own. That is the goal, whatever that means.
moving more on my own can apply to anyone, and I think that is kind of the definition of recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.
I'll stand up. Just me. I've been to 1 or 2 conferences, and I have never seen a payer here or any other conference. And to say I go to 1 or 2 is really a big understatement. What I like to point out, because I really do like hearing your comment about knowing that United Healthcare knows, but they don't show up. What I love about what FDA's transition has been in the last few years is that they're showing up and they're engaging. And we would feel so much more heard, I think, if they would engage with us instead of thinking that we're coming after them with pitchforks. I mean, we can hide the pitchforks.
I can tell you how to get them to engage.
Okay, I'd love that.
I can personally attest to their amazing partnership. Like, they have been fantastic with Onward. We are so grateful for the guidance and the just help along the way. I think it's been really incredible to have the kind of support from the different programs that we're engaged in with FDA.
And I think I can.
To be clear, that was about payers not showing
I know. I got so passionate about the point that FDA
I'm
is
like,
showing up.
I'm
like,
a
yeah,
fan.
Amen.
I'm
yeah,
a fan.
they're
This is
there.
not your grandma's FDA.
Yeah.
But I do also want to just quickly recognize that the passion in this room is so engaging. It's 4 o'clock on Friday on the last day of a session, and I'm glued. And this is like the closest we've gotten to a woe mantle, and it rocks. Thank you.
I just want to say really quickly, so at our meeting, we did get CMS. Took a lot of work to get them to come to our annual meetings a few years back. And I've tried. I've met with folks at Optum, at United Health, because they're based here. I've made efforts. I met with them, tried to actually I tried to even pitch the idea that, this notion of exercise is medicine. And no, I'm just trying to say, like, our personal experience, has been a real challenge to get them, and I hate to be so cynical, but I'm just going to say it, that we live in a for-profit-driven healthcare. It's not about public health; it's about revenue. And so there's a real challenge with how that determines and views people with chronic disabilities, chronic acquired disabilities,
Or a generalized responsibility to be good shepherds of public dollars. I mean, there is no.
And I would just, from someone who owns a physical therapy clinic and who basically deals with the payers every day, we have really good payers, and we have payers who we are no longer in network with, one being United Healthcare, because they only reimburse, it's $70 an hour, and for me, for a neuro person, I can't even cover my costs barely at that point. And the admin fees that I had to do, they would approve 4 or 5, maybe 6 visits at a time. And then I have to resubmit, and I have to resubmit all the medical document, and then they'll approve 4, and then they'll approve 2, and then you have to get on a peer-to-peer call. And so those kinds of things become so hard for people that have that. We're now starting to see that with some other payers, unfortunately, as well. And, for us, actually, Medicare has been pretty good to work with. We're not afraid to push it. If somebody gets to that 2,300 or 3,000, now they have, you can go past that. We go past that all the time because it's clinically relevant and it's medically necessary. So if your PT organization that you're going to is not doing that, you should be pushing them pretty hard. So,
Heather.
I want to throw out a couple of ideas and observations that I've seen on the BCI side. As I said, the collaborative community there just started, but I know that they're working on getting the payers involved right now. It is good when the community comes together and something organized. It's a little bit easier, I think, to then get the payers involved as well. Another option, one of the things that we're doing with BCI and looking at clinical outcome assessments, we're partnering with NIH on a workshop. That's another option to have a workshop in the DC area. It can sometimes be easier to get CMS there at least. They are understaffed, and I have someone on my team right now doing a detail in CMS. Part of it is to help them out because they are so understaffed, and part of it is so that we better understand the payer side. And so that the other thing I'm going to throw out there again is that FDA is there to help. You know, Kai and his colleagues are there to help the companies with novel technologies, you know, get information from payers, and as well as other stakeholders to really help you move forward.
I personally, like just CMS, it would be great if they would pay for a shower chair or a stander. I mean, those things are pretty basic, and we're helping people raise money. I'm getting used standers from people because they're not medically necessary, and that to me is really sad. Because if you don't stand, and we all know sitting is like the new smoking, and so people can't even get a stander or a shower chair approved. That's
well, and these are societal questions,
I know
societal
that's
problems,
totally
not
off
to get
topic, but-
carried away, and because my cynicism, I don't want to villainize CMS. I don't. Or FDA, like sometimes, you know, you all get villainized as from our community. It's like, well, FDA is the problem, you know. And we're constantly saying, no, FDA is not the problem. But there is a larger societal question. I raised it earlier that the amount of money that's spent to care for people with spinal cord injuries is so insanely larger than the money that's invested in researching to change the injury. It's ridiculous and anemic. And the problem societally to the public dollars is that we live in a society that does not appropriate, it cuts federal programs like FDA and CMS. So it's understaffed, overworked. We have to have a society that recognizes there is value in these things, and that's why taxes are important to pay for those things, instead of forcing them to be inefficient so you can come back and say, look how inefficient government is, we need to cut taxes. That's what's been going on for decades in this country. So it's a larger societal issue, not relative to those, you know, it's not villainizing these institutions. I just want to clarify that.
15 more minutes.
Go ahead.
Hi. Just wanted to make a comment about the whole idea of the flood. First of all, thanks to all of you on the institutional side. I certainly think you all care and put a tremendous amount of work into this. And on the community side, we all appreciate it. There's one thing, though, that hasn't been mentioned, and that's the sort of open source makerspace community. And Cosmic is an example of that sort of technology that is coming out now. But instead of really worrying about and kind of like fighting over scraps in terms of funding, in terms of applying for things, there's already some infrastructure in that there's local maker spaces. There are, you know, cheap manufacturing methods that are affordable to individuals with regards to 3D printing, but even on a different scale. With DIY electronics, I mean, once you have the design, honestly, it's not that difficult to put together. Like, it's certainly difficult, and it's all the more challenging if you have a physical disability. But that's one of the things about the flood, is that people are going to be able to build these devices now and share the designs and kind of collaborate on localized projects. And unfortunately, that raises quite a few issues, chief among which is safety. There's a reason why there's, you know, a firewall. And especially, let's make the distinction between wearable and implantable devices. Like, I'm sure that wearable devices, people probably feel safer in the DIY sort of thing. But in terms of implantable devices, that's something that I think we should talk about, because there will be an open source sort of foundation for people doing that, and having access to kind of a generalized pathway to have access to this hardware that you're implanting. Because after all, if you're implanting this hardware, it is a part of you. Like, that is, it's maintained, it's bought and paid for, but ultimately there should be some sort of agency. And I don't see, like, talk about the creation of this environment that allows people to develop their own highly individualized technologies. And there is just so much space for opportunity there. And that people can have positive outcomes that right now you have to organize a study. It takes years and years and years. In any case, I was hoping to get your thoughts on kind of that aspect of the flood, which is both kind of exciting and potentially dangerous, but I think is really promising.
So we're talking about spinal cord stimulation as a treatment, as a therapy, as a prescription, a medication, right? And so there will be opportunity to, it will explode in the private space and in the do it yourself. But as clinicians, we probably don't recommend that people go home and mix up a batch of statins in their kitchen, right? Because is that going to work?
I don't think a neurosurgeon is going to implant one.
Right.
And I think from, just from, if you think about it realistically, right, I don't know that many neurosurgeons are going to implant a device that someone's 3D printing. And I know there's a lot of capability now, and I actually have a bunch of engineering spinal cord injury students that come up with these really cool devices and bring into our gym, our PT facility all the time. But I don't know that anybody would do that. If people try to 3D print or come up with their own spinal cord stimulator, I guess that would be on them. But I don't know that as a clinic or as clinical, as someone who has a bunch of PTs and OTs on my team, I would never take a device that someone printed on their own or came up with on their own and use that clinically for either the patient or for anybody else at my clinic.
But that's the threat, right? That's the threat to everybody at the panel and everybody in the room, is we have an internet and there are devices and designs that are being developed. So if we, as a community, don't get our act together and get some actually regulated and well-designed devices to market, people are going to make their own. There's no denying that, right? So what I wanted to say, and Leslie, you mentioned earlier about comparing spinal cord injury with cardiovascular disease, right? Research and development likes to compare apples to apples, right? Does this Advil have the same effect in everybody? Yes, it does. Spinal cord injury is not like peripheral nerve stimulation or cardiovascular disease or anything where it's comparable across all people and the interventions are going to have a similar result. We're all little snowflakes. Every injury is different, every individual is different, and how it affects that individual is different. And same with spinal cord stimulation. We're not seeing the same effects from person to person to person. And we're concerned about that. We're worried. We're wondering why it's not the same. Why don't we get the same results in every single person with every stimulation we put in? And why is it different day to day to day? And we need to fix that. Maybe we don't. Maybe it's okay that it's different because it works and it helps people, right? So maybe I get better spasticity. Maybe somebody else gets better cardiovascular control. I'm happy with reduced spasticity, and somebody else is happy with better urinary function. It works, it helps. There's really not a lot that I've seen that's seriously dangerous, right? So maybe it's okay that it doesn't work the same in every single person. Maybe it's okay that it affects a whole array of the detriments that are associated with spinal cord injury. And maybe we need to just accept that and say, look, it's okay that it's not going to be apples to apples every single day in every single person.
But how do you prescribe it?
I don't know.
Yeah. We don't know.
Well, I think right now, right, people are implanting epidurals clinically, and that's a choice that every person who has a spinal cord injury decides or signs up for a clinical trial or decides to wait or decides to do what is personally in their own purview at that point of time. For me, when I decided to do mine clinically, it had been 14 years. I had been coming to conferences like this. I'm on the board of directors for U2FP. I felt well educated and understood the risks and benefits. And quite frankly, my neuropathic pain was so far, it would wake me up at night. It's horrific. So even for me, if that helped, which it's helped tremendously, I don't even take Lyrica anymore at all, and barely take baclofen, don't get UTI. So like he's saying, it's different for everybody. And so at some point, I think each and every one of us in this community make a decision for what makes sense for us.
And I think there's examples in the neurostimulation space already. chronic pain patients, they're not all the same, right? So we'd run studies and you look for a responder rate, just like Onward, you had a 72% responder rate in your transcutaneous. So you're looking for, you know, where you get a percentage, it's not going to work 100%. You know, pacemakers, they pretty much do. It's 100%, but in the neuroscience or neurostimulation space, it's not 100%. And I think there's a understanding of that. But you know, through understanding the types of patients to treat, you get these responder rates at a high level where the odds of it really, you know, having a benefit is good, that you can get approval.
And I think it's really important that when we talk to patients that are going, whether it's epidural, transcutaneous, you know, whatever it might be that's coming down the line, if NerveGen eventually, we need to be very honest and say, you may get a benefit, you may be able to stand, you know, like I can, or you might not really get anything. So we just can't tell people that this is what it is and this is what everybody's going to get. It's different, as you've stated, and we all know. Every single injury is different. Every single person's response is different. Just like, you know, baclofen barely works for me, and it works tremendously for other people potentially. So, you know, I think we all respond differently, and we all are unique snowflakes, and so we just have to remember that. And when we're talking to patients and people with injuries, to just make them aware, because when I've talked to patients about my experience, I've been very, very honest about what I have gained and what I haven't. But I also think that people tend to put on their happy ears sometimes, and they're like, I'm gonna get this, and I'm gonna be walking the next day. And that's absolutely not the case.
I also think it comes back to the real world data, because when I heard initially the Onward results, I thought that non-responders meant they got nothing, but they didn't respond to your primary outcome, but it doesn't mean they didn't respond to all of the others. So I think it goes to what we've heard in the room, that each person will have their own experience. And I think the more we can think of it as a system and all the body systems, and start to understand what are the body systems, because I would worry that the responder rate means, you know, that word gets used, that there's no effect, because that's not what I heard from this conference. It's you didn't respond to that outcome. So, but it doesn't mean you won't respond to something else, because I would hate to see some fear that there's no response, but because they will get, you know, there is a chance nothing, but there's a good chance something, and you don't, the stories we've heard, no one knows quite what that will be yet.
That's right, and I think from a, just very quickly build on that. I think the way we set expectations around that is really through the data that we're all generating together. It's through, Vanessa can speak to that, because we're talking about the results from the pivotal study, right? Those data will be used to eventually build materials to help educate folks after hopefully we get clearance for this thing. And that's how we set expectations of what's going to be available initially with everybody involved in this community, and we build on it from there as we learn together and learn from the real world evidence.
And just one more real quick thing. I think we need to really, as a community, as people in the spinal cord injury space, you have to keep your bodies ready, because I can tell you right now, both in my clinical trial and for people who have gotten the epidural stim, a lot of folks coming, for example, for the clinical trial have not done anything really, and now they're asked to work with upper extremity and even do 15 minutes of priming cardio, and they're just exhausted because they're not taking care of themselves and they're not doing it. And so then you go for these different types of neuromodulation effects or things that you're hoping will improve your daily life, but if you haven't taken care of yourself and aren't ready for that, yeah, it's going to be that less effective. So I think that's really important.
You know, we throw around these words, justice and equity. They are not mutually exclusive, but they are not the same. T.R. Reid wrote that excellent book, The Healing of America, and he posited that every nation builds a healthcare that reflects their values. Case in point, Canada prioritizes equity. It's an egalitarian society. Everybody gets primary care. But the rich and poor wait alike for specialty care. He waited for 18 months to have his shoulder looked at. The wealthy have always been able to afford better care. They can fly around the world to Leslie's point earlier. As somebody who doesn't meet the research criteria, both because I have an incomplete injury and because I'm too damn old, right? But I did raise pigs. I'm fine with the wealthy flying around because they may push the envelope, okay? They may push, because waiting 18 months or waiting 5 years for 25 years, that math doesn't work very well. That's not justice either. So to a lot of points that people made, waiting is not justice. So let's just keep on. As somebody who is nearly 70, I'm willing to be a guinea pig, okay, for those who follow behind me. I'm more than willing to be off-label. I have Medicaid mandated poverty, but I'm willing, and I'm happy that the wealthy and privileged, let's not demonize the wealthy nor profit. They both move the needle.
But does Medicare pay for off-label implantation?
No.
No.
They do not.
They do
but
not. That's the issue.
No, but Medicare, Medicaid.
It's not off-label, though.
Yeah.
Let's just purify the statement. Can you get reimbursement from federal health care for off-label?
But Leslie, no. But if somebody demonstrates efficacy by going off-label, then we might get there quicker.
Yes, and so I'm saying, yes, there's a value and there is a purpose to that, but let's not leave the field in this state for indefinitely, right? We have to move out and we have to get indications that will be covered by federal insurance for the indication.
That's the goal.
Which we are, and we're not. This conversation isn't to adjudicate anything around that. I think your point. Well, I think we're out of time, right? No, we're out of time. Hang on one second. What you said, I think, is very important to always throughout this conversation about real-world data, but also real-world practice. There's a problem sometimes I see in this space, the way we talk about rehab, the way we talk about, for instance, the guidance, the exercise guidelines for people with spinal cord injuries is absolutely ridiculous. From a practical standpoint, from an epidemiologic standpoint, it makes sense because so many people don't do anything. And so you got to get them to do something. So we have to constantly be thinking about this real-world application in the real-world frontier of primary care, health care for people with spinal cord injuries. Payers, practice, habits of people with spinal cord injury, and risk associated. It's very important that we think about that. Now, we're out of time, so I want to make sure that tomorrow you all know this is really a primer, like a shoving the shovel in the dirt to turn it. So tomorrow we can all sit down, those who are very interested in practical actions for answers to these, and they're answers that they're questions provoked towards answers. That will be...
Register for it.
Okay.
And it will be held here, right? Or
it's across the street.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. At McNamara?
Okay.
At McNamara?
Yeah. Okay, and with that, thank you all for coming. You are welcome to stay and continue this conversation without the assistance of our fantastic AV team. If you would like to get around in a circle and continue to talk, but we should be respectful of our time and space here. So thank you. I hope to see you all tomorrow.
And thank you all to our panel for participating in this conversation.